53 challengers, 53 failures, 0 blocks in 5 years. Not a close number, not a debated one. A number written down in a ledger that traveled from gym to gym in the trunk of a Cadillac, updated after every exhibition, never once needing an eraser. The prize sat inside a steel lockbox instead of a duffel bag this time. Somebody had learned a lesson from an earlier version of this challenge, the one where a duffel bag got passed hand to hand a little too easily. This one had a combination lock and a chain running through the handle, bolted to a folding table that had been bolted in turn to 2 sandbags. Nobody was taking that box anywhere without going through the man who owned the key. Inside it, 30,000, counted in front of witnesses before every show, then locked again. The challenge was 1 sentence long. Block him 1 time. 1 contest, 1 deflection, 1 finger on the ball before it crossed the plane of the rim. That was the entire contract. No time limit on attempts. No limit on how many defenders a challenger could bring, as long as they came 1 possession at a time. Just block him once. 53 men had tried. 53 men had watched the ball go through clean. He stood 6'7" in 224 lb, a wingspan that measured out past 7 feet when he stretched it wide, which he liked to do slowly in front of a crowd before every exhibition began, like a bird settling its feathers before flight. His vertical had been clocked at 44 inches on a machine in a university lab in 1978, and the man running the test had asked him to jump twice more just to be sure the equipment wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't. He jumped a 3rd time, same number. His nickname was Skywalk. Nobody remembered who gave it to him. By the time this story starts, nobody needed to ask. He had 6 dunk titles hanging over his mantle, 1 for every year. The tour ran a contest and a stack of newspaper clippings that called him things like impossible and unfair, and once memorably, a man built out of a rumor. He liked that one. He'd kept the clipping in his wallet for 2 years before it wore through at the folds. The gym that hosted the challenge that season was a converted armory outside Louisville, brick walls, a domed tin roof that amplified every sound into something bigger than it was. Sneakers on hardwood sounded like gunfire under that roof. A basketball hitting the floor sounded like a door slamming somewhere upstairs. The seats held 200 people. Every seat was full an hour before the first challenger walked out. Standing room went 4 deep along both sidelines, packed in tight enough that a man could not raise his arms without elbowing a stranger. They weren't there to see him dunk. Everybody already knew he could dunk. They were there because a number like 53 and 0 develops its own gravity after a while. People come to see if the universe still works the way they think it does, or if tonight is the night it finally breaks. 300 miles north, in a kitchen in French Lick, Indiana, a phone was ringing. The man who picked it up already knew who it would be before he answered, the way you sometimes just know. His name was Larry Bird, and he was standing at the counter in sweatpants, a bowl of cereal going soft in front of him, half a spoon still in his hand. You hear about this thing outside Louisville? The voice belonged to a cousin of his, a man named Wade, who worked construction and watched more basketball than any man with a full-time job had any right to. Wade talked fast when he was excited, and he was talking fast now. Which thing, Larry said. Not really a question. Dunk contest guy, Skywalk. 53 guys tried to block him over 5 years. Nobody's touched the ball. Not once. 30 grand in a lockbox chained to a table. Larry set the spoon down. How's he take off, he said. 1 step or 2. Wade went quiet on the other end, the kind of quiet that comes from a question you weren't expecting. I don't know, man. Does it matter? He's in the air for like a second and a half. Longer than that, maybe. Nobody's got a stopwatch on the man. Somebody should, Larry. How's he land, Larry said. Same foot every time, or does it change? Wade laughed a short laugh with no real humor behind it, more disbelief than anything. You're not thinking about doing this, I'm thinking about it. He's got a 7-foot wingspan, Larry. 44-inch vertical. 53 guys who trained specifically to jump higher than a normal human being, and every one of them came home with nothing. Height's not the question. Then what is the question? There was a pause on the line. In the kitchen, the ice maker dropped a fresh batch into the freezer bin, a small clatter that filled the silence for a second. Timing, Larry said. Everybody's been asking how high, nobody's asked how long. Wade didn't answer right away. He'd known Larry a long time, long enough to recognize when a conversation had quietly ended, even though nobody had said goodbye yet. You're really doing this? Saturday, right? Saturday. I'll be there, Larry said, and hung up the phone before Wade could get another word in. He didn't ask what the gym looked like. Didn't ask the rim height, though it was always 10 feet, or the size of the crowd, or what Skywalk wore when he walked out. He'd already gotten the only 2 numbers that mattered to him, and was already turning them over in his head, the way another man might turn over a crossword clue. Everybody else spending the week leading up to Saturday would be asking about muscle and vertical leap. Larry was asking about seconds. Saturday night, the armory filled early. Cigarette smoke hung under the tin roof, in long gray ribbons that never quite cleared, caught between the domed ceiling and the heat rising off 200 bodies packed into folding chairs. Somewhere near the concession stand, a radio played low-tuned to a station nobody was really listening to. The announcer worked the floor in a checkered sport coat that had seen better decades, microphone cord trailing behind him like a leash. He gave the numbers the way a man reads obituary, flat and respectful, and a little bit in awe of what they added up to. 53, he said. 53 men. 0 blocks. $30,000 locked, chained, and waiting for somebody to prove the math wrong. He gestured toward the table. The steel box sat under 3 spotlights, chain looped twice through the handle, padlocked to a bar welded into the folding table's legs. It looked less like a prize and more like evidence sealed and waiting for a trial that never happened. Skywalk walked out from a curtained doorway to applause that had more anticipation in it than warmth. He didn't smile for the crowd. He never did not until after. He rolled his shoulders once, stretched that wingspan out wide the way he always did, and let the crowd take its picture of him before he ever touched a ball. The first challenger of the night was a former Big Ten forward, 6'8", a reputation for shot blocking that had followed him out of college and into 3 different summer leagues. He set up in the paint, planted his feet where the file on Skywalk said to plant them, and waited. Skywalk gathered from 12 feet out, 2 steps up. He hung there a fraction longer than seemed possible, shifted the ball from his right hand to his left in midair, and finished on the opposite side of where the forward had planted. The dunk landed clean. The forward never left the ground. The crowd made the sound crowds make when they've seen something they already expected to see. Not shock, recognition. The second challenger was smaller, quicker, a converted track sprinter who'd built a reputation trying to beat leapers to the spot before they left the floor. He got there early, too early. Skywalk simply delayed his gather a half second, let the sprinter arrive and settle, and then attacked the space the sprinter had already vacated, leaning the wrong direction. Clean finish. No contact. A third man, this one built like a linebacker, tried to simply stand under the rim and absorb whatever came. Skywalk went around him with a single hesitation move that had no business working against a stationary target, and dunked from an angle the linebacker never turned to face. 3 challengers. 3 clean finishes. The gym had gone from loud to something quieter, more careful, the sound of 200 people doing math in their heads and not liking the answer. The announcer raised the microphone. Anybody else care to try? A long pause stretched across the floor. Somewhere in the upper rows, a folding chair creaked under someone shifting their weight. Nobody stood. That's when the voice came from a row near the back, flat and unbothered, like a man answering a question about the weather. I'll give it a shot. Heads turned in unison. Larry Bird stood up in a plain gray shirt, no warm-up jacket, no team colors, and started down toward the aisle. A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby seats, Not cruel, exactly more, the reflexive kind, the sound people make when something doesn't match what they expected to see. Wade grabbed his sleeve before he cleared the row. Last chance to sit back down and just watch. I didn't drive 3 hours to watch, Larry said, and pulled his arm free, gentle about it, and kept walking. The walk to the floor took maybe 30 seconds. It felt like it took longer. 200 people watched a man in street clothes cross hardwood toward a leaper who had just finished 3 defenders in a row without breaking a sweat. Larry's shoes made the same flat, even sound the whole way down. No hurry in his stride, no hesitation either. He stopped at the edge of the hardwood, bent down and untied both shoes, set them side by side at the sideline, the way a man sets down tools he doesn't need for this particular job, and stepped onto the floor in his socks. A murmur ran through the crowd at that. Somebody near the front row laughed out loud, a genuine laugh. This time, the kind that comes from watching something that seems less like confidence and more like a mistake in progress. Skywalk looked him over from center court, unhurried. 6 inches taller, 20-some pounds heavier. A reach that made the comparison look almost unfair from a distance, like watching a grown man line up against a teenager. "You defending?" Skywalk asked, not unkindly, more curious than anything. "I'm defending," Larry said. "You know I've done this 53 times. I know the number." Something in the flatness of that answer made Skywalk's eyebrow move just slightly, the smallest tell in the world. He'd heard bravado before. Heard fear dressed up as bravado more times than he could count. This didn't sound like either one. It sounded like a man reading off a grocery list. The challenge began. Skywalk gathered from 15 feet, his standard opening the same 2-step rhythm that had worked 53 times running. Larry didn't move toward the rim. He didn't move toward Skywalk's likely path either. He shifted 3 steps to his left, off any angle a normal defender would choose, and planted at a spot that made no sense to anyone watching from the stands. Wade, back in his seat, put both hands over his face. Skywalk left the floor. He hung at the top of his arc, a half-second longer than any human being should be able to, shifted the ball across his body toward his offhand the way he'd done to the first challenger of the night, and aimed for the same open finishing window that had worked every single time this year. Except the window wasn't open. Larry was already there, right arm extended, palm flat, standing in the exact space Skywalk had planned to occupy a full half-second before he arrived. Contact. A dry slap of leather against palm. The ball, deflected sideways, hit the top of the backboard square and dropped away from the rim entirely. No dunk. For 1 full second the gym made no sound at all. Then it broke into something between a gasp and a roar for 200 people trying to process a number that had just changed for the first time in 5 years. Skywalk landed and stood under the rim, looking at his own hand like it had betrayed him. He looked at Larry standing 4 feet away in his socks, right arm still extended from the follow-through of the block. "How?" Skywalk said. Not a challenge. A genuine question. Larry didn't answer. Not yet. The rules of the challenge were simple. 1 block qualified. The money was his the moment that ball hit the floor without going through the net. But nobody in that gym expected what happened next, because nobody in that gym yet understood the shape of the mistake Skywalk was about to make. The announcer, flustered, glanced toward the table with the lockbox, glanced back at Skywalk, unsure of the protocol for a moment that had genuinely never happened before. 53 attempts of practice, and nobody had written down what to do when attempt 54 actually worked. "You want it again," Skywalk said. Not a taunt, something closer to a man who needed to know for his own sake whether what had just happened was real or an accident of geometry. "Your call," Larry said. "Money's already mine either way. I understand the rules." "Then it's my call," Skywalk said. Again, this is the part of the story that matters more than the first block, because a single deflection can always be explained away as luck, as a strange bounce as one broken pattern in an otherwise perfect record. What happened on the second attempt is the part that turned a strange night into a story people still tell. Skywalk changed his approach completely. Where the first gather had been his standard two-step rhythm from 15 feet, this time he came from a full sprint starting near half-court, a version of his takeoff he saved for the biggest crowds, designed to compress the entire sequence into less than a second and leave no time for anyone to read him. It was by every account anyone in that gym had ever seen unreadable. That was the whole design of it. Larry watched him gather speed from 30 feet out, and here is the part worth sitting with for a second. He did not watch Skywalk's eyes or his hands or the position of the ball. He watched his plant foot. The exact half-inch shift in the angle of that foot as it hit the floor for the final step, the shift that told you, if you knew what to look for, which shoulder was about to lead the jump. Larry moved 2 steps right planted and raised his arm a half-second before Skywalk left the ground at all. Skywalk elevated into a finish that had beaten every single defender who'd ever guessed wrong about his shoulder lean. Larry hadn't guessed. He'd read the foot. Contact again. A cleaner deflection. This time, the ball knocked flat down into the hardwood, instead of drifting off the rim, bouncing twice before it rolled dead near the free throw line. 2 blocks, 2 attempts. This is where the story could have ended with Larry as the hero and Skywalk as the man who lost clean and simple, and it very nearly did end that way. But it didn't end there because of the mistake. The mistake wasn't athletic. It never is in stories like this one. The mistake was Skywalk's own pride, the same pride that had built a 6-title career and a nickname people said with a kind of reverence usually reserved for weather events. He looked at the lockbox on the table, looked at the ball rolling dead on the hardwood, and made a decision that no challenger, no promoter, no rule sheet had ever asked him to make. One more, he said. For real this time. The crowd, which had been building toward one kind of ending, went quiet again in a different way, the way a room goes quiet when it realizes the story it thought it understood has just changed shape. Larry looked at him for a moment. You already lost the bet, he said. Flat, no heat in it. I know what I lost, Skywalk said. I want to know something else now. What's that? Whether you can do it a 3rd time or whether you got lucky twice. It wasn't a smart thing to say. Wade, sitting in the stands with his stomach somewhere near his shoes, understood that immediately, the way you understand a mistake the moment somebody else makes it out loud. Skywalk had already lost the money. There was nothing left on the table for him to win. The only thing left to lose now was the last piece of the story people would tell about this night, and he was offering it up freely, out of nothing but pride, because a man who has never been beaten sometimes cannot stand the thought of being beaten and not understanding why. That was the mistake, not a missed step, not a bad plant, a decision to keep playing a game he had already lost because some part of him needed the math to make sense, again needed there to be a version of the story where the 3rd attempt cleared everything up and restored the world to how it was supposed to work. Larry didn't argue with him. He just nodded, once walked back to the same spot he'd used before, and waited. Skywalk gathered a 3rd time, and this attempt was different from the first 2, in a way that had nothing to do with speed or angle. He was thinking now, calculating, trying to build a finish that accounted for foot reading and half-second timing both, and thinking is the one thing that had never been part of his game before tonight. For 5 years and 53 challengers, Skywalk's game had been pure instinct trained so deep into his body that it required no calculation at all. Now, for the first time in that gym, in front of 200 people, he was doing math in the air. The hesitation cost him 9 inches of his usual elevation. Not much. Enough. Larry read the plant foot again, moved into position, and this time didn't need to fully extend to reach the ball. He met it at the low point of its arc rather than the peak palm flat, and the deflection sent it straight down into the hardwood with a sound that carried all the way to the back row under that tin roof. 3 attempts, 3 blocks. Nobody in that gym made a sound for a long moment. Then, the whole building seemed to exhale at once, a wave of noise that started somewhere near the concession stand and rolled out to the walls. Skywalk stood at center court, looking at his own hands the way a man looks at a machine that has stopped working, and he doesn't yet understand why. He wasn't angry. That surprised people more than anything else that happened that night. He looked more than anything like a man doing arithmetic he'd never had to do before, and finding the answer didn't match the number he'd carried around in his head for 5 years. "Say something," Wade called out from the stands, unable to help himself. Skywalk didn't say anything, not right away. He crossed the floor to where Larry stood still in his socks, and the two men stood close enough that the gap between them, which had looked enormous from the seats an hour earlier, suddenly looked like nothing at all. "You read my foot," Skywalk said. "Not a question, a confession. Every jumper plants the same way before he goes," Larry said. "Doesn't matter how high he goes after. The foot tells you first. 53 guys watched my hands, my shoulders, where the ball was." "Wrong information," Larry said. "By the time you can see the ball, you're already too late. Foot tells you before any of that." "And the third one," Skywalk said. "I changed everything. Speed, angle. I was thinking the whole way up. That's what did it," Larry said. "First 2 times you didn't think, you just went. Once you started thinking, you started hesitating, and once you hesitate, the foot tells an even easier story." Skywalk absorbed that for a moment, standing under the tin roof, with 200 people watching him work through something that had nothing to do with basketball, and everything to do with basketball. "I didn't have to ask for a third try," he said finally. "No. Why do you think I did?" Larry considered the question the way he considered most things, without hurry. "Same reason most men lose things they already had," he said. "Couldn't leave it alone once it stopped making sense." Nobody in the gym heard the rest of that conversation. It moved to something quieter, private, the two of them standing near half court, while the announcer fumbled his way back to the microphone and tried to explain to 200 people what they had just watched, using words that all sounded too small for the thing they were describing. The lockbox got carried over. Skywalk carried it himself, chain still looped through the handle, and set it down at Larry's feet. Larry looked at it for a second, the way a man looks at something he already knows the shape of before he opens it. He didn't kneel down to work the combination. He turned to Wade instead. "Take it to the front desk," he said. "Split it with the gate staff and whoever needs a ride home tonight. I'm not walking out of here with a steel box." Wade stared at him. "You're not taking it?" "Didn't come for it," Larry said. He crossed back to the sideline, sat down on the edge of the hardwood, and put his shoes back on, laces double knotted, taking his time about it, the way he took his time about most things. He didn't look back at the lockbox once. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room after something impossible gets proven possible, and it isn't the loud kind people expect from the outside. It isn't cheering. It's closer to held breath, closer to a held-back exhale, the sound of a few thousand people quietly rearranging what they thought they knew about what was and wasn't achievable. If you've ever watched something like that happen up close enough to feel the air change in the room, you already understand something most people never get the chance to learn firsthand. That feeling doesn't fade the way excitement fades. It sits with you. If you've ever been in a room like that, watching a wall come down that everybody assumed was permanent, that's exactly the kind of story this channel was built around. Not the loud victories. The quiet ones, the kind that happen in gyms nobody filmed properly, remembered only by the people who were actually there. If that's the kind of thing you come back for, consider staying around. Not for me. For the stories themselves, and for the people who understand why they matter. The gym emptied out slowly that night, the way gyms do, after something has genuinely surprised everyone in the building. People lingered near the exits, trying to describe to each other what they'd just seen, none of them landing on quite the same words. Somebody near the concession stand kept saying the same sentence over and over. He read his foot, like repeating it might help it make more sense. Wade found Larry near the parking lot, keys already in hand. "You knew," Wade said. "On the phone. Before you ever saw him jump. You knew exactly how you were going to do this." "Didn't know the outcome," Larry said. "Knew the question." "That's different. You asked how long he was in the air. How's that get you to reading his foot?" "Airtime tells you he can't fix a mistake once he's off the ground," Larry said. "So the mistake has to happen before he leaves it. Foot's the last thing that moves before everything else does. Watch the foot. You're not reacting to the jump anymore. You're already there before it starts. 53 guys never figured that out. 53 guys were watching the wrong thing, Larry said. Wasn't about being smarter, was about watching a different part of the same picture everybody else already had in front of them the whole time, and him asking for a third try. You could have just taken the money and left after the first block. Larry paused at that hand on the car door, looking back once at the armory's lit-up doorway, where a small cluster of people still stood talking, trying to make the night make sense before they drove home. Man spent 5 years being the only story in the room, he said. Hard thing to give up, even once you already know it's over. He wasn't trying to beat me on that third try. He was trying to prove the first 2 didn't count. That's a different kind of losing than the scoreboard shows. He got in the car. Wade stood there a second longer, looking back at the armory himself before climbing in on the passenger side. You feel anything? Wade asked. Walking out of there like that. 30 grand you just gave away to strangers. Wasn't mine to keep, Larry said. Came to answer a question. Got my answer. That was the whole conversation. No speech, no triumphant retelling, just 2 men in a car, pulling out of a gravel lot outside Louisville, while a story that would get repeated wrong in 100 different ways over the years, finished quietly behind them, exactly the way it had happened without anyone there, yet fully understanding what they'd need to remember to tell it right. If you're still here, that means something. It means you're the kind of person who reads past the headline number, past the flashy block itself, all the way down to the part of the story that actually explains it. The plant foot, the half-second delay, the pride that turned one man's win into 3 separate proofs of the same idea. Most people would have stopped reading after the first block landed. You didn't. That's not nothing. There's a particular kind of viewer who sticks around for stories like this one, and if you've made it this far, you're probably that kind of person. Somebody who understands that the real lesson in a story like this was never really about basketball at all. It's about watching the part of a problem that everybody else has trained themselves to ignore, because it's smaller, less dramatic, less exciting to talk about than the height of the jump or the size of the wingspan, the foot, the half second before the impressive part even starts. That's usually where the actual answer has been hiding the entire time. That's the reputation Larry Bird carried for the rest of his career, on and off the record, in stories people could verify, and stories that only survive because somebody who was there refused to let them disappear. Not the tallest player on any floor he ever stood on, not the fastest, not the strongest, rarely even the most athletic man in the gym on a given night, but the one who was always asking a different question than everybody else in the room, the one nobody else had thought to ask yet, and then quietly building an entire answer out of it, while the rest of the building was still measuring vertical leaps and wingspans and missing the one number that actually mattered. Skywalk kept touring for another 2 seasons after that night. The ledger updated for good, the number no longer 53-0, but 53-1, a line that got copied down slightly wrong in half the retellings, some of them claiming he'd been blocked once, others insisting incorrectly that it happened 3 separate times on 3 separate nights instead of 1. That's what happens to a true story once it passes through enough hands. It doesn't get erased. It just gets smoothed at the edges until it's easier to repeat over a beer than it ever was to actually watch happen live. The people who were in that armory outside Louisville that night know the real shape of it, though. They remember the socks. They remember the lockbox getting handed over and then handed away just as fast to strangers who needed a ride home more than a legend needed $30,000 he'd never come for in the first place. They remember a man saying quietly that he'd only wanted the answer to a question and meaning it. If this story landed with you the way it was meant to, leave a like so it finds the people who'll actually appreciate the quiet parts of it and not just the block itself. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because there's another one of these coming, a story about the night Larry Bird turned down a straight cash offer that would have made every teammate in that locker room a wealthier man, and walked out the door anyway without explaining why for 20 years. Some legends get remembered for the loudest thing they ever did. His just keep getting remembered for the quiet math nobody else thought to run. The tallest wall in the room is never actually the one you can measure with a tape.